Welcome to those who just joined us. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes at the start of the hour. So thank you for being here and we're excited to learn with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for registering for part 3 of the Safe and Supportive Learning webinar series presented by the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs and UEN Reimagine Teaching. The title of today's webinar is Affirming the Experiences of All Students, Gender Identity and Development in Schools. Our session will equip each of you with information on how to develop supportive and inclusive learning environments while building skills that you can apply during blended learning environments and platforms, both online and in terms of in-person teaching. We also want everyone to consider the unique mental health concerns for youth of color in light of COVID and civil unrest. My name is Dr. Joel Arvizo Zavala. I currently serve as a curriculum specialist with the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs, as a researcher with the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, and as the executive director and co-founder of Resilient Education Consulting. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and co-presenter for their introduction. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hale Hashtperi. The pronouns I use are they, them, and theirs. Very excited to be with you all this afternoon. I am currently a fifth-year PhD candidate at the University of Utah in the Educational Psychology Department, specifically in the Counseling Psychology program. And I have worked with LGBTQ youth in various capacities for the last decade or so, whether it's outreach, advocacy, clinically, and I'm very, very excited to share some of this information with you all. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we are moving into this presentation, Dr. Joel and I wanted to ground this presentation in three very specific concepts that we will revisit throughout various points of the presentation. So firstly, we want to offer this idea that the work that we're going to encourage all of you to do is going to be incredibly personal. So what that means is that both today, during this presentation and moving forward, we really want to encourage you to take a look inward, examine some of your own perceptions and experiences as you are thinking about ways that you can create an inclusive classroom. Similarly, we want to ground this presentation in the concepts of representation and acceptance. So this idea that part of creating an inclusive classroom is ensuring that the children and students are able to see various types of gender identity and expression throughout the classroom. And also this idea of acceptance, meaning that we wholeheartedly invite the students in our classroom to explore their gender and be authentically who they are. So with that, we will go to the next slide.
As me and Hale were planning for this presentation, we wanted to make sure that we provided you with not only a solid framework regarding it, the work being personal, about issues of representation and acceptance, but also something to guide your thinking today. For us, this quote from Maya Angelou is not only relevant, but is an important reminder about how we do difficult work in schools, how we do difficult work with our students, and ultimately a reminder of how we ground ourselves in the teaching and learning mission that we have, you know, in the profession as educators and with the children and families that we serve. So this quote, "Hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. Invite one to stay." As you can imagine, this work is incredibly difficult. When we work with, you know, queer youth, LGBT youth, when we work with gender nonconforming youth, these are all terms that we'll discuss in detail in our presentation today. We want to remind you that it's okay to be a little bit anxious or fearful about doing work that is unknown or different from what you're accustomed to. We also want to encourage you to be incredibly hopeful. During times of civil and political unrest, you know, these are actually the most important times for us to engage in work that is incredibly meaningful and representative of the students that are in our classrooms. So once again, hope and fear cannot occupy the same space, so invite one to stay. And essentially, we're asking you to choose hope. We hope that hope is what you'll choose to stay. Next slide.
Okay, so just a quick review of what our goals are in our work together today. So, firstly, we will review a bit about the various inequities that youth of color and LGBTQIA plus youth experience. We will then move into a discussion of language related to gender and sexual identity, and specifically why language is such a powerful and important tool for us to have. We will then spend a little bit of time discussing and understanding what gender identity development can look like for youth. So, when might we expect to see different types of gender exploration and identity development? Really a developmental approach on that. We will then offer a little bit of storytelling, and specifically in the context of that storytelling, specifically the intersections between identity in gender and identity as a teacher, and what that might look like for you all. We will then move into a more interactive and reflective activity where we will ask each of you to spend some moments in introspection and reflection on your own experiences of gender. So how might we move forward in constructing our own understandings of identity? And then finally, we will finish the presentation today in some discussion of creating gender and sexual identity affirming spaces within classrooms and schools. And within the context of that discussion, we will also revisit those three grounding concepts of personal, representation, and acceptance. Next slide, please.
So this slide is where we're going to start our introductions about conversations regarding gender. Gender is all around us. It is a set of identities. It is the experiences that we have as human beings. Gender is embedded within the policies and laws that we have to follow or that we have to practice our profession within. Gender is everywhere. And one of the most important things that we can do when we understand gender is to begin to put some understanding, some knowledge, some history, and some context behind it. At the very top of the slide, I want you to really focus in on two sets of words. The first one is policing, and the second one is cisgender. In this presentation, when we refer to this notion of policing, we're not really actually speaking directly to the idea of a police person or a police department, but rather this phenomena or this experience that happens in schools where we as teachers, I'm a teacher myself, we as educators oftentimes have a lot of rules and policies that we have to follow, and subsequently we have to ask our children and our students to follow those. But sometimes those policies and those practices end up making young people feel excluded or unwanted or misunderstood. And so we have to be really, really careful. We have to be careful about when we're asking students to behave in a way that is reducing harm. We have to be careful about when we're asking students to behave in a way that is promoting collaboration and joy and discussion and learning. And the way that we get away from policing the bodies of children is by bringing some consciousness or some knowledge into it. The other term that you'll see there at the very top of the slide is this concept of cisgender. Cisgender basically means an individual whose biological sex at birth matches how they identify with their gender as a person. So someone who was biologically born as a male, they would be considered cisgender if as a young person or as an adult, they also identify as male. And so cisgender is the beginning of our discussion today. Before we talk about those three book titles that you see in front of you, I want to share the bottom of the slide first. When we look at our experiences as teachers and educators, many of us became educators because we see children as reflections of our collective dreams and our greatest hopes. Our students are worthy of unconditional regard. They are humorous and curious. They are intelligent and full of potential. Their lives give us purpose. As someone who has spent, the better part of a decade, in classrooms and in schools, I have dozens and dozens of stories about that are reflective of the joy that I get to experience. Those moments when you see your students sort of like light bulb, turn on when they finally understand a mathematical concept, or when they're reading with greater fluency. We have, memories and moments with our students where they're struggling, but we encourage them to keep going because we know that they're capable of learning and developing new skills and understanding new things. And we love being able to see that. I know that I love being able to see that in my students. It's the reason why I am an educator, why I am a teacher, why I am a researcher, is for the purposes of teaching and learning. It's a beautiful experience, and it's something that is very important to us. For those of us who teach in the K-12 system or even in higher education, the value of teaching and learning is everywhere in the work that we do. But what happens when that part of us is lost, the sort of the curiosities and the joy that we sometimes have in our profession? It's easy to have that joy and that curiosity be lost. Our profession is full of hundreds of demands, hundreds of policies, hundreds of pieces of information or parts of curriculum that we have to teach in a very specific way by a very specific, through a very specific amount of time. And so the first thing that I want to offer everyone is that it's okay to sort of lose sight of ourselves as educators and the reason why we became educators in the first place, because our jobs are inherently overwhelming. One of the ways that I've learned to deal with the overwhelm in my profession is through knowledge. As a young educator, for me, knowledge was power, because in some ways, and in a very naive way, knowledge was a way for me to learn what was right and wrong. But as I've become a more seasoned professional, knowledge isn't necessarily about being right or wrong, but it's about knowing what can be done and what's possible. And so these three books, which I encourage you to write down their titles and authors, are books that will most certainly help you understand the experiences of gender identity in schools, the experiences of queer youth and LGBTQI plus youth in schools. They're some of my favorites. The Right to Be Out is an amazing text published in the year 2010. It will give you as educators, and it's given myself, a really clear understanding of the legal backing behind this work. I want everyone on this webinar today to know that it is legal and possible to have, LGBTQI affirming literature and books and lessons in the classroom, that you can support, gender nonconforming youth, that you can have conversations about non-traditional families, in your classrooms, and you will be protected because you're exposing students to new ideas, right? And those new ideas and that learning is protected by law in many, many ways, even in places or states where it may seem like it's being restricted on a daily basis. The book Push Out is also an essential read about the experiences of Black girls in our country. For Black, cisgender girls in particular, their bodies, their hair, their clothing, their mannerisms, the way that they speak are highly policed. It can make a lot of educators really uncomfortable when they haven't had experiences to learn about Black girls and Black families and what it's like for them to navigate issues of race and gender in our country and in schools. And so this is an amazing text that I encourage all of you to get from the library, to purchase, to borrow from someone. It'll help you learn a lot about issues of gender and Black girls specifically in our country. The last one is Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out. This is a great text because it talks about gender, cisgender, it talks about the full spectrum of gender. It gives educators such as myself and all of you an opportunity to read just the lived experiences of students and children in schools. So I wanted to make sure that I offered you these resources at the very beginning. For me, the way that I regain hope in the profession is by reading, by learning about what's possible, and reminding myself that my responsibility primarily as an educator is to create a better community and a better world. And I do that by grounding myself in books that challenge me and that help me learn and grow. Next slide.
Wonderful. So let's take a few minutes and find some shared language. So I'm sure that many of you have heard, the acronym LGBT, maybe LGBTQ, perhaps even LGBTQIA with a plus. And, I unfortunately won't be able to spend time discussing every single one of these identities, but I do want to ground us in some common language that we can both use to discuss these various identities and experiences with each other, but that I also would like to encourage you all to use when you are discussing ways to create inclusive classrooms with colleagues, school administrators, so on and so forth. So as we talk through language, I would like to highlight some of these identity labels that you may or may not have familiarity with. And one of the things that I also want us to, or I would like to encourage or invite you all to do is, when we are using identity specific language, one of the things we want to be careful about is not making assumptions about what term or label somebody may identify with. So before I talk about any of these specifically, I would really like to encourage you all to take that courageous step to ask somebody, right? What or how they identify. And taking it even one step further to learn what that specific identity means to that person. So one of the pieces that I would like to emphasize here is that each one of these identity labels may mean something different to each person who uses them, okay? So I'm going to talk about these very broadly, knowing that there will be individual differences in how people experience each of these identities. So firstly, let's talk a little bit about the term or label bisexual. Okay, so here the descriptor that's offered does use some language that I would actually like to encourage us to resist a little bit. Okay, so here it identifies somebody who is bisexual as somebody who is attracted to both members of their same gender or opposite gender. So specifically, the language that I would like us to resist is this idea of opposite gender. And let's talk a little bit about why. When we use this term or label opposite gender, it implies that gender is a very binary concept, meaning that someone may only be man or woman, male or female. And that if you're not one, then you are inherently the other. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is ways that gender can be non-binary, okay? So think about ways that you can resist some of that very binary language. Another term that I would like us to explore is transgender. So transgender is considered an umbrella term with many, many identity labels that fall underneath it that essentially means that the sex that somebody was assigned at birth, whether that's male or female, is not congruent with the gender identity that they experience or have in adulthood. So for example, somebody who was assigned female at birth may identify as a man, okay? What we also know about transgender identities is that underneath that umbrella, there's also another umbrella section of non-binary gender identities. Sometimes somebody with a non-binary gender may identify with the term or label trans, and other times they may not. So that's one of the things we want to be paying attention to and not necessarily making assumptions about that, okay? So what is a non-binary gender identity? This is one where maybe a person identifies with a combination of masculinity, femininity, maleness, or femaleness. Maybe there's an entire rejection outright of maleness, femaleness, or some type of mix, whether that's somebody who identifies maybe a little bit more with masculinity, maybe a little bit more with femininity. It is very much a spectrum, okay? And then moving into this identity label of queer. Queer is another umbrella term that while historically was and can still be used in a derogatory manner has been reclaimed by LGBTQ plus communities as a term and identity of empowerment. Sometimes the queer identity is also accompanied by some type of political orientation, okay? And then I would also like to quickly touch in on asexual. So I think asexuality is an identity that is often missed or doesn't receive as much visibility as some other identities under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And one of the things I really want to emphasize here is I think there is this assumption that asexuality means there will be no sexual behavior, there won't necessarily be any type of romantic or intimate partnership. And that's also another concept or conceptualization that I would like us to resist. So asexuality may mean that somebody is bi-romantic. Maybe they have romantic attractions to people of various genders. They may choose to engage in sexual behavior, they may not. So again, we want to resist this idea of assumptions. And then the last piece that I will touch in on is if you look to the image on the bottom left corner, here this identity of two-spirit is a umbrella label that is used by some indigenous folks in North America that essentially encapsulates a gender identity that is non-binary and also not cisgender. So, and typically, or this can be accompanied by ceremonial or social roles within that person's cultural group or circle. So two-spirit is just one example of the ways that racial or ethnic identity or culture can intersect with somebody's gender identity. And we see some of these culturally bound gender identities in, South Asia, in the Pacific Islands, so on and so forth. So just something else for us to keep in mind here. Next slide, please. And that is still me. So let's talk a little bit about gender identity development in youth. So one of the things that I want to really emphasize here is how early children start to pick up on gender. Whether that's observation of gender in others or observation of gender in themselves. So as early as age 1 or 2, children start to become conscious of the physical differences in gender. So whether that is observing clothing, hair, different shapes of body, so on and so forth. So children are attuned to that at a pretty young age. And then by age 3, there will typically be some self-labeling in children as either a boy or a girl. So they start articulating some of their own gender as early as age 3. And then by age 4, they start to not only observe gender in others, but this idea of gender constancy. So what this means is that they start to notice that gender is something that is stable, and they may consider it permanent in others because of what they have observed in those around them. Also starting around age 4, and there's a lot of variability developmentally around when children might engage in this process, but starting around age 4, children may start to engage in what's called gender play. And this really is the idea that all children in some way, shape, or form explore different variations of gender expression and gender roles. So this can be trying out gender typical behaviors. So behaviors that, societally, stereotypically are associated or affiliated with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And they also may explore a variety of gender behaviors and interests. So whether that is exploring sports or creative arts or various types of performance, so different types of interests, different types of behaviors. The length of time that children spend in gender play is incredibly variable. Some spend only a few days, and some spend several years in this time of gender play. And then starting around age 5 or 6, this is when, and I think it's really interesting that this is around when children are starting school, right around age 5. Of course, some a little bit earlier, but this is when children really start attending to social norms. This is when they start internalizing both overt or explicit and more implicit or subtle messages from the adults in their life, whether that is being encouraged to engage in a particular behavior or interest, or discouraged from participating in a particular interest or behavior, or types of clothing they might want to wear, or how they might want to style or cut their hair. So they really attend to specifically this piece around what is accepted, what are they learning is appropriate and okay. And even beyond that, what is rewarded, what is valued. And they internalize that, and it can influence or dictate how children experience and understand their gender moving forward. And then finally here by age 7, we start to see some gender constancy in children as well. So this is when children really start to solidify their own sense and understanding of gender. The one last thing I would like to offer here is that there is research that supports that childhood trans gender identities are as deeply rooted and stable over time as their peers' cisgender identities. So something to keep in mind there. Next slide, please.
So one of the things that we wanted to offer you today were some example, or at least one example of what this looks like, doing work as teachers, as educators in schools. So I want to share with you the story of Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson is a fictional name that I have applied to the story that I'm about to share with you. And I've also changed some of the details of the story to protect this teacher's identity. But Mrs. Johnson was a dedicated and determined teacher. Coming from a strong family of ranchers and farmers, she believed in hard work and determination to get the life that she wanted. Being in the military and coming into teaching much later in life also taught her that the incredible value of hard work. She believed herself to be a good LDS individual, so Latter-day Saints individual, with great devotion to her faith and an unrelenting belief in children and the goodness of people. Coming into an urban school where nearly 90% of the students were students of color, or sometimes we use the label BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. This caused her to question her methods, her values, and even if she belonged in such a school. When her first transgender student was enrolled in her class, her views were challenged even further. After a 3-hour meeting that I had in my office with this teacher one day, I thought that we were at an impasse. Prior to this meeting, this teacher was incredibly resistant to any idea of supporting this trans child, even having this transgender child in her classroom. And I personally thought that we were at an impasse. It was a very, very difficult experience for many, many weeks. And it was really hard for me as someone who, is an individual who promotes gender and gender inclusivity in schools. It was really hard for me to work with someone directly who was so resistant to this idea. And mostly I was very concerned about the mental health and well-being of the child, given the fact that this was the class that this transgender girl was going to be in. As time would tell, and after private consultation with her bishop, she decided that it was time for a change. And specifically, there were 3 things that happened for Mrs. Johnson. Number 1, Mrs. Johnson wasn't afraid to have a very, very difficult conversation with me. In fact, during the time that we were having this conversation, it got so heated that a fellow staff member closed the door to my office so that no one else could possibly hear what we were talking about. As you can imagine, we were talking about very difficult subject matter revolving religion and spirituality, moral beliefs and values, what was appropriate. This teacher expressed concerns about exposing their other students, to this transgender child and whether or not it was appropriate to promote transgender issues in her classroom. And so the ability for this teacher to have a difficult conversation with me provided the perfect opportunity for me to have an immense amount of respect for her, because the first thing that happened was she made the decision to have the conversation with me. The second piece that happened is she shared with me a lot about the importance of her religion and how her religion informs her teaching. Going back to what I shared in the narrative on the slide right there, you know, she had an unrelenting belief in children and the goodness of people. And that she shared with me that day in my office, that it was because of her religion, her being a member of the church, the Latter-day Saints, was an important part of why she became a teacher and why she made lots of decisions in her life. And so I had the opportunity to learn about and from her what it means to do that. And we had some really hard conversations and a really difficult discussion about how sometimes we have to put our personal beliefs aside in order to support our students. And she was very brave. She asked me that day in my office, she's like, do you put your religious and spiritual beliefs aside? And I could honestly answer yes, because sometimes that's necessary in order to create safe spaces for the kids that we interact with every day. I also shared with her that sometimes it's hard because these are parts of who we are as teachers and we can't just pretend that they don't exist. The last thing that happened, and this was after her consultation with her bishop, and I never found out about what that conversation was about, as I felt, and Mrs. Johnson felt, that it was private. But what I do know is that conversation was very illuminating to her. And after she had that conversation with me in my office that day and with her bishop, she decided that it was time for her to create some trans and LGBT affirming experiences in her classroom. She requested my assistance to find children's books that look at families who may have parents of similar gender, right? She asked me for resources. She scheduled a meeting with me and the parent of the transgender child so that we could have a conversation together about how to support this transgender girl, how to prevent bullying, how to create an environment that was going to make her successful as a transgender person. And so I wanted to share this story with all of you as a reminder of not only the difficult work that's necessary when we do and create gender affirming spaces in schools and classrooms, but that it is possible. And I'm so, to this day, and forever grateful to Mrs. Johnson and the hope that she had in her own desire and ability to change and grow. Next slide.
Okay, I would like to invite each of you who are with us this afternoon to take a moment and reflect on your own gender identity. So what we're going to do is, take a moment and we won't necessarily get to respond to each of these questions right now. So I want to encourage you to keep reflecting on some of these questions beyond this presentation. So as we reflect on our own identities of gender, and also the way that we express that gender, so gender expression being things like clothing, hairstyle, behavior or mannerisms. This is how we choose to project our identity of gender out there into the world, okay? And this is something that is on a spectrum similar to gender identity of masculine or butch to feminine or femme, with androgynous falling somewhere in between. And I really want to, again, encourage us to think about this on a spectrum. So you may find yourself somewhere along here that's not necessarily on one end or another. So keeping both gender identity and expression in mind, I want to invite us to reflect on some of these questions. So before we think about and respond to some of these questions, I want to front load and say, for some folks on the call right now, this may be vulnerable or bring up a lot of intense emotions. And so please tune in to what some of these questions are unearthing in you. And participation in this activity is invitational and voluntary. So please listen to your own kind of reactions as they show up. We would, however, really encourage and invite our cisgender viewers to participate if you are able. So what I'm going to ask all of you to do is we'll take one question at a time. And if you could please respond to that question by posting something in the chat so that everyone can see. So let's take this first question to start. So what does being a whatever gender identity exists for you? So what does being a mean to me? We can just, whatever comes up, can put it in the chat. And as you're thinking about this, some of you may be thinking about or reflecting on this for the first time, and that's okay. It might be hard to answer this question, or you may not have a very clear sense of it right now, and that's okay. That's part of why we're asking these questions, is just to really prompt some of that reflection. So we have being a cis woman, presenting as femme androgynous. Being a woman means I'm strong and capable. Being a two-spirit person means honoring my ancestors and giving myself permission to not have to choose just one gender. It means the opportunity to discover myself each day. Yes, I love that. Because how we experience gender and how we express our gender may vary and change from day to day. It means I see gender as a beautiful spectrum. Wonderful. Okay. Challenging traditional gender stereotypes. Strength, resilience, vulnerability, power, and pain. Yes. Okay. Thank you all who participated. These are some really lovely answers. It means I can love and give unconditionally. A responsibility to share my gifts. Okay. All right, let's reflect on one more. And you all will have access to these reflection questions after the presentation. And I really just want to reaffirm my invitation to continue reflecting on some of these questions after this webinar. So let's take a look at this second question. And similarly, if you feel comfortable, please leave a response in the chat. How do I know that I am my gender identity? How do I know that I am my gender? I feel safe and comfortable in how I am perceived. Okay, yeah, powerful. What about for others? I know that I'm two-spirit because an elder shared with me one day that it was okay for me to be more than one gender. They told me the stories of my ancestors, and shared how I had an important place in this world. I know I am my gender identity because it feels authentic to name it, live it, and experience it. It feels like skin, and that without it, I am not complete. Yes, wonderful. I feel what I see, but I also have been taught what my gender role should be or could be, and I have felt safe expressing according to my assigned identity. Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you all for participating. Keep sitting in some of that. And what you'll notice in the rest of these reflection questions, there's an opportunity to take a look inward on choices you make about expressing gender, and also considering how you might relate to others based on your gender identity. I'm thinking about the last two questions here, okay? So keep looking inward, keep reflecting on some of these. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked about quite a bit already, and so now we want to share with you a little bit about how we envision inclusive classrooms for trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ youth can look like. So I want to bring us back to those three original concepts that I offered at the beginning of our presentation: the personal work, okay? And then also the work in representation and acceptance. So as we think about creating an inclusive classroom in the personal realm, we would really like to invite and encourage you to reflect on your thoughts, emotions, behaviors, biases. A lot of times, biases that we may have internalized over time can show up in some difficult feelings. It may show up in specific behaviors. And so I want to really emphasize here that living in this country that essentially operates under these various systemic and structural oppressions, and the way that that shows up in our day-to-day life. I really want to emphasize that each one of us has internalized these biases. So I don't want you all to make this about, oh, I have done something wrong, this is this and that, right? So I want us to think about it as this is something that each one of us has a responsibility to do. Okay, so really reflect on those pieces. If you're having an uncomfortable or difficult emotion or reaction to a person, a student, a conversation topic, take a moment and explore what's behind that. Okay. I also would like to encourage you all to continue to explore your own gender identities. And I think a great starting place is some of those reflection questions that we were just looking at in the previous slide. And then also remembering that each of you has the agency to create safety, courage, and change. So I really want you to remind yourself that you have that agency. Moving into representation, really prioritizing having affirming literature, imagery, and curriculum in the classroom, okay? Because we want the kids and the students to know that different types of genders and expressions are okay, and that there are others who may experience and express their gender in a similar way. Also would like to invite you and encourage you to challenge binary thinking with colleagues and family members, okay? So going back to that slide around language, resisting that binary language, okay? And then also being ready for pushback or critique or questions that may feel difficult as you are working to incorporate inclusive practices. So think about that as an expected outcome. Okay, this work is not easy, but incredibly, incredibly important.
Within the realm of acceptance, we have some more recommendations, as you can see there. One of the best things that you as an educator can do is resist punishing or being too critical when young people of all ages engage in gender play. Rather create space for it. For me, as I mentioned earlier, my pronouns are they, them, and theirs, but my gender identity is also two-spirit. And so even today, I was very excited about, sort of engaging in my own gender play with my scarf. You'll notice here there's an imagery of the elk tooth, which is a very important symbolic and spiritual piece for certain indigenous tribes, here in the United States. And this was gifted to me by someone very special to me. And so even as an adult, for me, I give myself permission to experience gender play. I have pierced ears, and so sometimes I usually wear small hoops or big hoops. Sometimes I even experiment with, mascara and these other pieces. And even for me as an adult and someone who has come to terms with my non-gender binariness, my two-spiritness, it's scary. It's scary as an adult to even participate in gender play. But just make sure that you create spaces for that, because you want your children to feel that unconditional positive regard from you. Model gender acceptance at school. When I was working directly in schools as a teacher, I would do this all the time. That's actually where I learned how important it was to model gender play and to do these things with students, especially young children, when I was working in elementary schools. But even in high school, remind students that you're accepting of them and model acceptance. When you see that bullying or, those harsh names or those epithets, don't be afraid to say, it's not appropriate. Let's find another way for us to share or to communicate or to talk about people who are different than us. And that goes directly into the last recommendation, which, address slurs and hate speech as they occur, right, in the moment, for the elementary grades on the playground, in higher education, during your lectures, in middle school and high school, during your classrooms, during lab, during all these places. And don't be afraid if you make a mistake the first few times that you do it. The most important thing is you want to do it through restorative justice. We hope that some of you had the opportunity to see myself and my wonderful colleague, Nubia Pena, present during the first session on the school to prison pipeline, where we discussed restorative practices. And, we have to remind our students that we make mistakes. And more importantly, it's important that we learn from our mistakes, and that we have and give ourselves permission to change. Next slide, please. So for the purposes of our workshop and seminar today, we've developed this model that we hope all of you will be able to use in your work in schools. So we're going to start at the top in the blue and then work around clockwise. So number one, understand and acknowledge your fears. Understand and acknowledge the fears in your students. It's okay to be afraid to discuss and to think about and to wonder or be curious about issues of LGBTQI identity and gender identity in schools. In places such as Utah, Utah doesn't always provide the best circumstances for us to do this work, but that also means that it's a wonderful place to do this work and to challenge some of the status quo. Acknowledge your fear, but as that quote at the beginning of the presentation suggested, don't live in your fear. Use hope, use knowledge, use learning, use modeling, use colleagues, use the trust that you have with people that love you and care about you to guide your work. Moving next into the green area, we want to focus on tangible safety. And when we think about tangible safety, it's three things. Tangible safety is psychological safety, it's emotional safety, and it's physical safety. So whenever there's bullying in school or name calling or the threat of physical violence, remember that you're offering those tangible safety points to all students, but particularly be mindful of students of color and intersectional students, gender non-binary students, students who are exploring their queer identities or their gender identities. And remember that as a teacher, and as educators, we have a responsibility to promote and sustain tangible safety, psychological, emotional, and physical. Let's move down to the bottom in the yellow. Remember that as educators, everything that we do is grounded in teaching and learning. It's okay if we're not, psychologists or social workers. It's okay if we haven't done a ton of research in the area of gender identity. We just have to be ourselves. And by ourselves, everything is about teaching and learning. So every moment, every difficulty in the classroom regarding these issues about gender and identity, use them as teaching moments, because that is our greatest strength. That is what we're trained to do, and that is what we love. So never forget that. The last piece is probably maybe even the most important, the red piece, and that is set clear boundaries regarding inclusion. Every child in your classroom in higher, in K-12, and then your students in higher ed, everyone deserves and has the right to be included. And so make sure that if anyone ever challenges your desire to have a more inclusive curriculum, or to have gender affirming literature in your classroom, or to have conversations about gender and sexual identity in the classroom, remember that you are protected, that there are legal protections for us as educators who do this work. And most importantly, let people know that you have a boundary and don't let them cross it. And that boundary is everyone is welcome in my classroom. And so remind people, if they challenge you and they threaten you with harm or disciplinary action, set that clear boundary and just know that your internal strength can guide you to do this work better. Next slide, please. So we want to go ahead. We purposefully left some time in today's webinar for questions, and we would be happy, myself and Hale would be happy to answer any questions that you have of us. So please feel free to put those into the Q&A, and we will respond to them as they come along. So it looks like we have one already. I'll read it out loud. So from Amy. One of my students confided in an essay to me that they were transgender, but didn't want their mom to know. Other than being supportive, do you have any other suggestions? Hale, I would love for you to go ahead and start off. What are some suggestions that you might have in this situation?
Yeah. And when I think about this idea of being supportive, it's quite broad. And I think that's such a critical and important piece of it. So whether that is offering room for some of that gender play within the context of your classroom, whether that is being very intentional about the way that you talk about and address any essentially what other students might be thinking, saying, really encouraging and inviting that conversation into the classroom. Because I think one of the things that I think I see pretty commonly is, this piece of when, a kid says something that, may not be an appropriate thing to say or a kind thing to say. I think sometimes the response is to just say, oh, you can't say that, but instead being really open to and willing to having a conversation with the rest of the students in the classroom as well, as much as appropriate or needed. So I think really the big piece is letting that student know that it is okay for them to be who they are in your classroom. And then I also want to really encourage some of that personal work as well. I think that's going to be a big thing that I come back to in this Q&A is, reflecting a bit on how was it for me to receive this disclosure from this student? Did I experience nervousness, fear? Why? What's behind that? Or if I am feeling curious or worried about how I'm going to interact with this student, what's kind of behind that? And so I really also want to encourage some of that self exploration as well. Hoel, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hale. The one thing I would add to that is remember, as an educator, I like when I was working when I was in the classroom and in schools, I can't remember where I originally learned this, but remember that when students share a part of their identity with you, consider it a gift, right? It's a gift and an opportunity to understand a student. And the fact that they were safe enough to share that with you already speaks leaps and bounds to who you are as an educator and the spaces that you've created for them to disclose that information to you. Most importantly, in terms of support, it's really about, getting to know them a little bit better. Some of the questions that I used to ask my students were, with my elementary grade students, I would say, how are things for you out on the playground or during lunch? Are people, saying hateful things to you? Are people including you when they go play games out on the field? Is there something, so I could figure out if there's something that I could do with them in those situations. In the middle school and high school, when I taught at the high school level in particular, a lot of it was giving them their own, helping them develop their own language about how they assert themselves, how they create safe spaces for themselves, how they identify, how they use, language to say, you don't get to treat me that way, right? And then in the college classrooms, I spent a lot of time, many years, training future teachers. And in those classrooms in higher ed, a lot of it was just about discussion. We're going to talk about this, and I'm going to create space for you for us to be people. So just really excited about all the recommendations that Hale provided, and those are some additional ones that I have as well. So it looks like we have another question. So this is from Ali. Can you address advice for when other teachers are not providing a safe space and are triggering your students? Is it okay if I start with this one, Hale?
Please, yeah, please do.
Okay. Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question because, oh goodness, I have a lot of experience with this. I think most importantly, we want to offer understanding and grace even to our colleagues, and maybe especially to our colleagues. We want to remind ourselves that, usually in situations like this, a person just hasn't had the opportunity to develop a language or understanding or to get out of that place of fear regarding issues of, sexual and gender identity. And so if I've learned anything, schools, every school's a little bit different. But for me, over the years, I've developed a three-pronged approach. Number one, I check in with my fear and I ask myself, is this a conversation that I'm willing to have with this teacher? And usually the answer is yes, because if it's important enough, then I need to have the conversation. Number two, I always have these conversations face to face. If I am trying to figure out, how best to respond, I usually try not to go to other teachers to talk about the situation. I usually try to use people outside the school, such as, maybe my partner or a family member or another person in the community, so that they can help me build some language around this so that I feel prepared, right? And then number three, you just have the conversation, but go ahead and detach from the outcome, right? Your job as a teacher who's willing to do this work and wants to do this work is to just do the first step. You can't expect other people to be on the same playing field with you, in this work, but you can be someone who models bravery and courage. And so have those conversations with them, but detach from the outcome and just have trust in yourself that, because you never know when one conversation, like my conversation with Mrs. Johnson, could potentially change the track that that teacher goes on. So those are some recommendations that I have for you.
And I don't really have anything to add. I think Hoel really did a great job answering that.
All right. Are there any, we probably have time for one more question if anyone would like to put that into the Q&A box. All right, those were really, really great questions. Thank you so much for asking those. Let's go ahead and wrap up. Next slide, please. So this will be included in an email that'll be sent to you later on. This is a list of resources. As you can see from this slide, we have lots of different resources here, from educational organizations to the Human Rights Campaign, Psychology Today, school administration journals and websites. All of these are just really accessible, fun reads for you to engage in and learn more about the things that we talked about today. So please feel free to use those and to reach out, to myself or Hale with any questions. I think we're planning on also providing our contact information in the email that we'll be sending out to you. Next slide, please. Just want to quickly give credit to all the images that you saw in our presentation today came from some really, really wonderful websites. And in fact, some of these websites are additional resources that you could also look to as well. So these will be included when we share that email with you later on. And last slide, please. So we just really want to thank all of you for joining us today. To our audience, thank you, and we express our appreciation for joining us today and supporting our webinar series in partnership with UEN. In the next few days, as I mentioned, you'll be receiving an email from our team with a list of resources referenced in this webinar. Your certificate of completion for the session will also be included. And remember, that counts towards your Reimagine teaching project. You'll also receive an evaluation link, which is very important to us. We ask that you complete the evaluation so that we can improve the final session in this training experience. Lastly, we invite you to join us during part 4 of our Supportive Environment series, which is scheduled for Thursday, November 19th at 4 p.m. and will be facilitated by Monica Candida. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, as well as for your commitment to creating brave and safe learning spaces for our children and students. We wish you and your loved ones safety and health, and hope to connect with you during part 4 of our webinar series. Thanks again, and have a wonderful evening.